Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but also, as you will see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my hope that the answer is made useful not only to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question is with regards to individuality in the past. Mr. Soup, we live in an age of ego. Facebook and Twitter send our opinions, thoughts, and inane daily lives, hurtling through cyberspace, gumming up the screens of friends and family alike. Ultimately, however, and I do count myself in this, he says, it is hard to escape the fact that these are rather narcissistic endeavours. I.e., we love being us, and I love being me, and we want to share it with the world. My question is this: is there any evidence that people in the past valued individuality as we seem to today? Thank you for your time, Tom the Homophile. I like what you've done there, Homophile. Very clever, very clever. Well, Tom, you ask a very worthwhile question. Actually, I have touched upon some of these issues in a previous Questions of Doom video, when I was asked whether or not it's possible to see individual ancestors in archaeology. So I won't revisit those particular issues. I'll assume that you've watched that video. Indeed, I shall put the link to it in the information just below. However, there is one aspect of that video that bears repeating, and that is to do with the idea of l'émoi. The notion that in the post-war epoch, the post-Second World War era, we are now far more aware of an individual, or indeed our individual lives, than we ever have been in the past. This is, of course, a theory. Not everyone agrees with it, but it's an interesting thing to bear in mind. So, there are several strands I'd like to talk about today. One of them would be genetic legacy. Now, Hamilton's rule states that we will only die for people who are, or rather we will more easily die for people who are more closely related to us than those who are not. It's all to do really actually in anthropology with regards to altruism, to why do we do things for other people. And one idea is that in terms of giving our lives, we are more likely to do it for certain folk than others. And this is to do with genetic legacy. It's to do with whether or not we are passing on genes which are similar to ourselves. Now, in this sense, this implies that a sense of individual, or at the very least a sense of identity tied in with who you are and what you are, is on some level instinctual, that it is to do with our very beings as evolving, self-preserving life forms. However, obviously, there are many instances which break that rule. There are many instances of people who die for other folk who aren't related to them. But nonetheless, it's an interesting notion that somehow actually the preservation of self and the preservation of those who are similar to ourselves implies a certain sense of individuality that may well be universal amongst human beings, if not all life on the planet. Now, this also as well feeds into, in other strands of anthropology and psychology, the nature of what it is to be an individual. Anthropologists have actually identified various forms of personhood, as it's called, or rather, as I shall refer to it. There is the dividual, not the individual, but rather the dividual. A person who is composed of the community in which they live, objects, substances, and the like. And they are multiply authored. So in other words, you would count yourself in such a situation as being essentially partly your mother, partly your father, partly your auntie, uncle, brother, sister, partly the lady round the corner. And you often, in such communities, you do not necessarily put all of your attributes down to yourself. Rather, you are a result of that communal effort. And in that sense, this has the potential to infer, or rather, sorry, to affect rather how you behave as a person, and whether or not you consider yourself to be an individual or part of a more nuanced group. Now, an element of this is something called partible personhood. Partible. Now, this means that a person can be scaled down. Essentially, you can shave off parts of yourself by returning objects and substances to the community. Now these represent yourself. So often, for example, in marriage, people will give back to either to their own family because they're about to maybe inherit a dowry, or other circumstances to do with debt or gift giving. People literally consider a gift given to themselves as something which adds to who they are and what they are, and therefore they're taking on an element of the person who has done the gift giving. And at some point, that gift or that element of themselves will be returned to the person who did the giving, or rather their family, or something, or maybe a part of that other person's kin group. And in this way, the person who is doing the receiving and the giving considers themselves, first of all, to be augmented by receiving, and then somewhat diminished by giving away once again. Now, this is not necessarily linked with positive and negative emotions. You don't necessarily feel as though you are having your limb pulled off in these transactions, but rather you don't consider yourself, again, to be an autonomous human being around which an economy is functioning. Rather, the economy is intrinsic to who you are. Your gifts, your objects, your body, your very being. Is encapsulated in all of these things at once, and therefore, if you give it away, give away something which has been given to you, you're also giving away part of yourself. Now, this also as well leads into another form of personhood. I'll only look at 3 today, and that is permeable, whereby things aren't externalized. You're not represented, as it were, by the things that you own or the things that are in you or around you, but rather you have innate qualities which are augmented or diminished by receiving and giving. This is called permeable. So this means that essentially such transactions, they pass through you. This can range from receiving a cup of wine all the way through to giving money to someone. But what it means again is that you're constantly being reimagined and added to by the lives and interactivity of other people around you and to you and through you. Now, all of this is very complicated, I'm well aware, but nonetheless, what it all implies is that the notion of the individual is not universal. While there may be individual experience, for example, I can't see even what my wonderful wife sees, what Mrs. Soup sees. I'll never be able to see that. For many people, that does not necessarily separate them from other people. And this has big implications not only in anthropology but also obviously for archaeology, because it shows us and hints that there are other ways of conceiving of oneself, other ways to think about who we are in the world in which we live. Now, in all of these situations where permeable, dividual and partible selves are passing around in other forms of social activity, it is thought that lots of this actually maps back onto our sense of individuality anyway. For example, there's the notion that we are, in the so-called Western world, constantly fighting between our dividual selves and our individual selves. That is to say that I feel very much as though I am the result of the effort of my parents, or rather my mum in particular, who has put into me an awful lot of effort, monetary, love, emotional energy, and out of that has come me as a human being. I consider myself to be an individual, but I am a product of dividuality. So I can trace, as it were, where it is I think I come from, in that sense, in an emotional and in an economic and in a physical and in in a spiritual sense, if you were, as it were. If you consider yourself to be an entity, I suppose, yeah, in an entity sense, I know where I come from. So this fight, as it were, this constant tension between our individual selves and our individual selves is something which, even in Western society, it is believed we are constantly experiencing throughout our lives. So even though you may never have heard the word dividual, often we do have aspects of our personality which are in fact dividual. Now, how this relates to the past, Tom, the homophile, is when it allows us to imply that people in the past thought in different ways, as I've said. So one excellent example would be certain Neolithic burial mounds, long mounds in Britain in particular, which contain sorted bits of people. Now, for a long time, this confused folk. People going, well, that's a bit strange. But if you start to think of these folk as being alternative forms of individuality, or rather personhood, then you can start to see actually that by taking bits of different people and putting them into one monument, indeed selecting elements of the body, literally bones, so maybe a scapula from one person and an ulna from someone else and a radius and a femur and a skull, and all putting it into one place, they become an amorphous entity. They become the ancestors. They are not individual folk. They are in fact one lot of people. This may actually tell us a little bit about how people at that time thought about themselves. They were not individual folk. They were in fact dividual or partible or permeable folk who existed together as an entity, which was very complicated, to do with, as I say, economy, to do with emotional indebtedness. And out of this came this expression of identity, which minimised the individual and maximised the whole, the community. When we look at certain parts of the world in the Mesolithic, for example, in cemeteries in Scandinavia and around Denmark, it is clear that people could attain individual status even as children. We have a child burial, for example, in particular in Vedbeek, I believe, where a young boy, basically an infant, has been buried with a knife, essentially with the sort of status that afforded often to adult males, or thereabouts. So here we seem to see, or rather there is the hint, that this person has an individual identity which has been afforded to them. They are allowed to keep that identity in the grave. They are buried with their parent, who also has an individual identity, and they are together. They're not the same, and they're not mixed in with other folk. They are in fact two people who have been buried in the same grave, in that instance anyway. So this again hints at the fact that maybe in that instance there were in fact individuals, appreciable individuals. And what all this really starts to imply is that the notion of the individual has been in flux throughout time. Whether or not this is in response to social requirements or environmental pressures, who knows? But the relationships are bound to be complicated between these factors. In other cases, you will see active cultural rebellion or cultural anomalies. For example, I often think about there's a burial in Roman Catterick, where a man has been buried as a woman. This is probably because the community themselves, and indeed the man in life, considered himself, or at the very least dressed as a woman in some way, and therefore he was buried as a woman by the people who buried him, the people who knew him. This, again, hints at a sense of individuality, but also hints at active cultural rebellion and therefore difference. It is an anomaly which highlights that individual person, and therefore gives you another sense of what individualism was at that particular point in time. Not only that, but also obviously there are writings, particularly from the classical period. There are various folk in, for example, Chinese history who have written philosophies and histories and their opinions. And even, for example, the Vikings wrote opinions in runes in Maes Howe, the Neolithic tomb in Scotland. So again, through all these different strands, you start to get different senses of individuals, often actually through opinion or, as I say, some form of cultural rebellion. And this really challenges the initial premise that I put up, that the idea that the individual is simply a modern invention. It probably isn't. It almost certainly isn't, because obviously an opinion is something which is usually individually formed, or at the very least individually accepted from someone else and then passed on. However, the fact that you may be part of a broad community, for example, this Neolithic mind potentially, does not stop you from acting as an individual. So I'm not saying that if someone expresses an opinion, they are wanting to go on Facebook. Rather that that spectrum of existence is testified throughout time in different places around the world. So, I suppose in summary, Tom, the homophile, it is actually a very complicated picture. To answer your question, was individuality valued as much as we seem to today? It depends on where and when you were. But I suppose what I would say is that what we see throughout archaeology is that individual action is what contributes to the whole. Whether or not that action is testified explicitly in archaeology, for example in a burial or an expression of opinion or cultural rebellion, dressing alternatively, etc., is to a certain extent irrelevant, because when the overall picture that you get of the culture is comprised of persons who are acting in that culture. So yes, individuality was, to some extent, important as we might recognise it at certain times, but also individuals, i.e. people or persons who may be dividual, partible, permeable, have always been the medium by which culture has expressed itself, and therefore has resulted in the archaeological record. So hopefully this has gone some way to discussing some of the issues surrounding the importance of individuality. And at the very least, I suppose, hopefully you'll go away and think, am I a dividual or an individual? And the answer is probably a bit of both. So there you go. Thank you very much, Tom, for asking the question. If anyone else out there has any thoughts, opinions or comments, please do feel free to comment below. I'm sure Tom would love to hear them. And as ever, I suppose, look after yourselves, and until next time, bye-bye.